Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're continuing our morning session with Carole.
Can everyone hear me okay? All right, terrific. So I want to thank Alan, Sander, and Janet for organizing this lovely conference. I want to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota is built on the traditional lands of the Dakota people. And I also want to apologize for changing the title of my talk. I wanted to get more directly to the point of what my vision for the future for the philosophy of science is, and that is empirical, socially engaged research on the social structure of science. Okay, can you see the next slide? No, it's not working. Here we go, okay. So since the time of the logical positivists, the philosophy of science has moved beyond theorizing about normative logical relationships between scientific claims to theorizing about normative social relationships and practices. Part of the shift is attributable to epochal work in feminist epistemology, which argued that logical relationships are not sufficient to bridge the gap between statements describing data and hypotheses. Because background beliefs and values must be brought to bear to identify evidential relationships between such statements, and because background beliefs and values can vary across scientists due to individual idiosyncrasies and more systematic perspectival differences shaped by social location and experiences, Helen Longino and others have argued that other tools internal to scientific practice must be invoked. In particular, scientific communities must cultivate social relationships and practices, facilitating critical exchange and uptake across a diversity of expert opinions to avoid idiosyncratic and systematic bias in the evaluation of scientific hypotheses. By shifting the object of theorizing to social relationships and practices and the institutions that structure them, this movement invited philosophers of science to engage in questions about the normative social structure of science. Meanwhile, philosophers and philosophers of science have embraced the idea that their research should be socially engaged and relevant. Social engagement includes a range of activities, including communicating and working with stakeholders to address structural questions about policy, regulation, and institutional design. The goals of these efforts can be simply to inform. So Catherine Plaisance is here. I'm so excited to see her. Her recent study of 35 philosophers of science found that 64%, the majority, listed policymakers as an important audience. Others have the further aim to affect social change. So the same survey found that for a minority 20% of respondents, it was very important that policymakers utilize their work. A research orientation that resonates with the Vienna Circle Manifesto's vision that the philosophy of science should shape social life. At the intersection of these movements is socially engaged philosophy of science about the social structure of science. This area focuses on communicating and working with stakeholders in science to address structural questions about policy, regulation, and institutional design. This area of research moves beyond thinking about how values and evidence are interwoven in the tapestry of science to focusing on how we can critique and change the loom itself, the institutional frameworks and norms that structure how the tapestry is fabricated in the first place, to borrow metaphors from Kevin Elliott and Heather Douglas. To do impactful work at this intersection, it's not sufficient to talk about important problems and just talk about them. We must provide relevant epistemic resources for informing and possibly even catalyzing changes to real-world scientific practices and institutions. Given the power of empirical research to inform and affect change, I would like to advocate for the epistemic and practical value of empirically socially engaged research on the social structure of science. In this talk, I'll use my research on Black-white disparities in scoring and funding at the National Institutes of Health to illustrate the epistemic importance of disciplining our philosophical hypotheses with empirical data and analyses when appropriate and possible. I will also use this example to illustrate the practical power of real-world evidence when it comes to informing and catalyzing changes to institutions in science. To close, I'll highlight some changes we must implement in the social structure of philosophy and the philosophy of science to support empirical, socially engaged philosophy of science. All right, so let's discipline ourselves first. All right, so on the way to being useful towards informing real-world changes to scientific institutions, philosophical hypotheses about the social structure of science should be disciplined by real-world data and analysis. Like practicing scientists, we must take due effort to get it right, to ask just the right questions to serve the purposes at hand, and adopt the right methods to answer them, or ones that are right enough for those purposes. The risk of conducting empirical studies, of course, is that we will be proven wrong. And I hope to convince you that null results can humble us with important epistemic feedback about where our efforts would be better focused and can, in some instances, still inform and affect social change. To illustrate how all of this can work, I'll share some details about my collaborative empirical study on NIH grant review. The early conceptual origins of this project began with a solo-authored paper that introduced a new category of peer review bias called commensuration bias to explain problematic patterns of publication and funding in science. Commensuration is the process of converting distinct, heterogeneous qualities into a single metric or scale of value. Commensuration bias recognizes that reviewers may weigh peer review criteria in flexible, context-sensitive, problematic ways. So for example, at NIH, reviewers are asked to score grant proposals along individual criteria: significance, innovation, approach, investigator, and environment, and then weigh those different criteria as they see fit when scoring for overall impact, which is a kind of summary score. I propose that perceived conservatism in NIH grant review, the preference for methodologically less risky projects, could be understood as the underweighting of innovation relative to approach. I also raise the possibility that commensuration practices could vary as a function of the social identity of the individual being evaluated. I had the incredible opportunity to evaluate this last hypothesis empirically with collaborators from the University of Washington in statistics. So I want to call out especially Elena Orosheva, who's the now director for Center for Statistics and Social Sciences at the University of Washington, in addition to being in the statistics department and School of Social Work. And then Sheridan Grant, who was a then grad student working on the project. And then the other three collaborators were all from the Center for Scientific Review, which is responsible for handling the vast majority of peer reviews at the National Institutes of Health. Richard Nakamura was the director of the center at the time of the study. So we hypothesized that reviewers weigh peer review criteria scores in ways that disproportionately lead to lower overall impact scores for Black versus white researchers. This hypothesis was motivated by psychological research in the context of hiring and admissions, which found that evaluators give preferential weighting to whatever criterion boosts the overall score for individuals belonging to preferred social groups. To do this work, we had access to R01 applications. The R01 grant mechanism is the oldest and largest grant mechanism at NIH, submitted by Black and white researchers in fiscal years 2014 to 2016 for a total of 890 applications from Black PIs who received more than 2,000 reviews written by more than 2,000 reviewers. We matched applications from Black PIs to those from white PIs at a ratio of 1:3. We matched for applicant characteristics, including gender, ethnicity, career stage, degree type, and NIH funding bin. We also matched along application characteristics, including application type, so whether the application was a new application or renewal, application amended status, which was first submission versus resubmission, and application integrated review group or area of science. Race and ethnicity information was self-reported by applicants using categories defined by the Office of Management and Budget. This information was not shared with reviewers, though they see applicant names and other possible race-related cues in submitted biosketches. Now, commensuration bias as a hypothesis was so promising an idea as to win first prize for most creative idea at the NIH's 2014 Peer Review Challenge, creative enough to present at the PSA in addition to well-respected philosophy of science programs in their colloquia. What did we find? Commensuration bias turned out to be so small in effect as to be practically negligible when accounting for why reviewers assign lower preliminary overall impact scores to Black versus white researchers. By pushing my conceptual project into an empirical one, I managed to refute my own hypothesis. Commensuration bias was not an intervention point worth investing more attention and effort towards. This was an incredibly humbling epistemic lesson about why philosophical research about important problems in science should discipline its hypotheses with real-world data and analysis. It was also a painful personal lesson about how much effort it can take to disabuse yourself of your own clever idea. So in this case, gaining access to federal peer review data, not even accessible through Freedom of Information Act requests, forging a collaborative team, hunting for multiple rounds of funding from 2 different institutions, navigating highly bureaucratized data and personnel security processes, and more than 4 years of cross-institutional effort. That's added to the 2 years of time it took to hunt for and convince NIH to give us access to the data. So it's a 6-year project. So along the way to discovering this null result, however, our paper did reveal epistemically and practically important evidence about other possible intervention points in NIH peer review. The commensuration model we use is an interaction model. Since it's standard practice in statistics to fit a main effects model before fitting an interaction model, we also evaluated whether disparities in preliminary overall impact scores could be explained by differences in a number of key variables. The overall picture that emerged from the models was that disparities in preliminary overall impact scores could be fully accounted for, not by differences in applicant or application-specific variables or biased commensuration practices, but by disparities in preliminary criterion scores. To illustrate this, we created frequency histograms to show the differences in preliminary criterion and preliminary overall impact scores. In purple, we have applications from matched black PIs and in yellow, we have applications from the matched white PIs. In orange, we have the overlap between these groups. You can see that reviewers assigned worse criterion scores to black investigators, their scores are shifted to the right, compared to white PIs, even after matching PIs by career stage, degree type, NIH funding bin, application type, amended status, IRG, which is area of science, gender, and ethnicity. Now, philosophically, these results demonstrate that NIH's peer review criteria do not appear to serve as the impartial democratizing tool that normative theories of procedurally objective science would require. Instead, the regime of excellence federally mandated at NIH, and it turns out at other federally funded science institutions, can serve as a primary source of systemic bias. Like cases of algorithmic bias, NIH's facially race-neutral criteria and processes disproportionately harm individuals belonging to historically protected groups. As epistemologists and philosophers of science have pointed out, these lower scores may be due to reviewers' devaluation of the methods and topics of research interest to Black scholars. From an institutional perspective, the irony of our result is that NIH had introduced criterion scoring in 2009 in its enhanced peer review process, with the hope that adding scores to each criterion would increase information and transparency for applicants. This change in policy accords with wisdom drawn from psychological research and articulated in hiring guidelines suggesting that increasing attention to pre-specified criteria when evaluating applicants could decrease social bias in evaluator assessment. Because our paper found that funding disparities remained mostly the same, despite the switch to scoring individual criteria, and because we found that disparities in overall impact scores could be fully accounted for by disparities in criterion scores, we concluded that preliminary criterion scores absorb rather than mitigate racial disparities in preliminary overall impact scores. Now, from a philosophical and institutional perspective, these results corroborate the importance of structure-centered epistemic analyses in science. According to Christy Dotson, structure-centered epistemic analysis, a foundational tool in Black epistemology, hones in on how institutions shape what gets to count as evidence, relevant interpretations or actions in relation to that evidence, and relevant contextual features. As such, structure-centered epistemic analyses uncover how institutions control the logic by which the threads in the fabric are thought to be best interwoven. For example, in her analysis of the epistemology used to defend the legitimacy of police officer Darren Wilson's murder of Michael Brown, Christy Dotson identifies how policing laws bestowed police with authorization to kill people allegedly behaving similarly to Mr. Brown. In the context of NIH, its peer review criteria, codified by the Public Health Service Act, are epistemic insofar as they identify what Congress and NIH have identified as relevant considerations when evaluating a scientific grant proposal's overall impact. I take the empirical results of our study to give even higher priority to questions about how we can expand our conceptualization of peer review criteria to capture a richer, more inclusive notion of research excellence and impact at NIH and in academic institutions more broadly. Okay. Now, given the epistemic standing and rhetorical power of empirical research in science, philosophers of science who engage in empirical research about the social structure of science can increase the potential practical impact of their work, including changing the loom of science itself. So here's a little history of our project. We submitted our paper to Science Advances in September 2019. 4 months later, in January 2020, Washington State reported the first confirmed case of COVID-19 in the US. On May 25th, 2020, a Minneapolis police officer murdered George Floyd with the aid of a second and third officer who restrained Floyd and a fourth who prevented bystanders from intervening. 9 days later, by happenstance, our paper was published online. In its first month of publication, our paper was viewed more than 10,500 times. Scientist activists galvanized by racial disparities in COVID-19 infections and deaths, racial discrimination and exclusion in science, the causal connections between those inequities, and the Black Lives Matter movement cited our work in commentaries and news articles. Our paper was one of roughly a dozen references in a couple of highly visible pieces. A letter signed by more than 10,000 scientists and published in Science called for an end to systemic racism in higher education. A letter called Fund Black Scientists, authored by a newly organized coalition of 260 and now more than 400 women faculty in biomedical engineering, and published in Cell, called for NIH to acknowledge and commit to addressing systemic racism, including changes to NIH's peer review and funding practices. In March 2021, in response to this mainstreamed reckoning with structural and systemic racism, as well as internal organizing efforts, NIH, the largest public funder of biomedical research in the world, publicly apologized for its structural racism and launched its new equity initiative, Unite. This multi-pronged initiative commits NIH to the regular measurement of race-related outcomes in its intramural and extramural programs, as well as elevating health disparities in minority health research across institutes and centers. More recently, NIH announced plans to update its peer review process, so investigator and environment will no longer be evaluated along a 9-point scale, but in binary terms as sufficient or not, in hopes of decreasing prestige bias in peer review. Only future empirical structure-centered analysis can determine whether this change decreases scoring and funding disparities. Unite obliges NIH to make sure that such work is carried out and to communicate this publicly, an important change since, as I mentioned before, information about peer review scores and rejected proposals would not otherwise be accessible by FOIA requests. And the sensitivity of this information can be inferred from really visible studies on NIH peer review published in Science and elsewhere, which were given access to information only about accepted applications, not rejected ones. So the lesson, I think, for this section of my talk here is that empirical, socially engaged research on the social structure of science can provide epistemic resources that are sufficiently legible and credible to scientists, policymakers, and institutions to be actionable for stakeholders playing different roles at multiple levels of hierarchy in science's complex system of power and influence. All right. Now, philosophers of science have long argued that in order to support socially engaged research, we need to change the social structure of the philosophy of science and of the philosophy departments that tenure, hire, and promote faculty. So hats off to Janet for her talk earlier, as well as to Catherine Plaisance, who will be presenting later. Now, to support empirical socially engaged research, we should implement these kinds of changes, but with a sensitivity to challenges specific to empirical projects. Foundationally, we must reconceptualize what it means to do impactful work. Impactful work can include other activities, including service roles within scientific institutions, organizing efforts outside of them, collaborative contributions on empirical projects and policy reports, improving science education, and brokering relationships of trust, or creating systems for managing distrust among scientists and non-scientists. Valuing these efforts requires looking beyond publication in philosophy and philosophy of science journals. Note that few papers published in arts and humanities journals generally get cited in policy reports, white papers, clinical guidelines, parliamentary transcripts, and legal documents. Impact need not be measured in terms of the size of the populations or the prestige of the subdisciplines involved. For example, academic communities are increasingly recognizing the epistemic and social value of community-engaged scholarship, which is often co-created with historically marginalized and unjustly treated communities to address research questions of mutual interest. Now, because socially engaged research and empirically socially engaged research can be more time and resource intensive, we also need to rethink what it means for a scholar to be productive. Impactful projects often involve extra steps, including face-to-face interactions, cultivating relationships of trust, and translational work to bridge disciplinary differences in epistemic and professional practices like authorship, publishing, and grant pursuit. Empirical projects require applying to and receiving institutional review board approval, securing data, starting and sustaining collaborative teams, and procuring funding to capture collaborators' time and support their disciplinary professional needs. Given how many years it can take for socially engaged projects, empirical or otherwise, to bear fruit and their increased risk of failure, the effort and impact of a scholar's activities may not be commensurate with their number of or total fractionated contribution towards papers, conference presentations, reports, blog posts, or other knowledge products. And given the nature of the work involved in bringing an empirical project to fruition, collaborating philosophers may sometimes need to take non-leadership authorship roles, like first author or last author, ceding these to grad students and or faculty leading the quantitative or qualitative analyses as appropriate. Departments and universities in their hiring, tenure, and promotion decisions must rethink how to measure the productivity of impact-facing work with a sensitivity to the specific costs, risks, and friction that researchers bear on their scholarly path. One possibility is to evaluate and reward socially engaged research, not just for their epistemic and social outcomes, but for their progress along any key steps in the process of impact, with an appreciation for the ways in which philosophers' authorial contributions may be limited by the nature of the projects and the collaborative teams involved. To promote empirical, socially engaged philosophy of science, we must also help philosophers of science build networks. Productivity. All right, sorry. To promote empirical, socially engaged philosophy of science, we must also help philosophers of science build networks, present at science conferences, talk with stakeholders, and collaborate. Even though individual philosophers tend to value interdisciplinarity in the abstract, philosophy has not been very collaborative in practice. So in a previous research project with some folks, we looked at papers published from 1960 to 2011 across fields represented in the JSTOR corpus. We found that philosophy had the third highest proportion of single-authored papers at 89%, topped only by classical studies, which was at 93%, and history at 92%. For empirically minded, socially engaged philosophers of science, there are now a number of conferences focused squarely on metascience, the scientific study of scientific practices, which attract researchers across disciplines, as well as other stakeholders, including institution leaders and science reporters. Metascience conferences include those hosted by the International Conference on the Science of Science and Innovation, the International Society for Scientometrics and Informametrics, the Research on Research Institute, and the Center for Open Science. In addition, the Center for Open Science has initiated a new Metascience Alliance program, which aims to cultivate divergent ideas, create weak ties across disciplinary and sector silos, foster career pathways for budding metascientists, and to form and launch research and entrepreneurial collaborations. Now, not everyone bears the risks of conducting socially engaged scholarship in the same way. Graduate students are especially time pressured to create a record of success, and tenure stream faculty may want to wait to achieve tenure first, as I did. For those who would like to work on empirical, socially engaged scholarship on the social structure of science at a later, safer point in their careers, there's no shortage of conceptual, synthetic, and modeling work to do in the meantime, especially work that motivates downstream empirical study. As philosophers of science and philosophers, we can explicitly categorize these projects as belonging to the philosophy of metascience, therefore recognizing metascience, or the science of science, as yet another special science for which philosophers of science can specialize. Developing deep expertise and motivating hypotheses for empirical work can be attractive to collaborators and provide fodder for grant proposals and pilot studies, and this work can help scholars hone their perspective on the kinds of projects they would like to prioritize in their own work. So to conclude, in this talk, I've advocated for the epistemic and practical value of taking on empirical, socially engaged research on the social structure of science. Doing so gives philosophers of science an opportunity to discipline their claims empirically and develop a more grounded perspective on what challenges merit attention and effort. Moreover, empirical, socially engaged research on the social structure of science can provide what scientists and stakeholders embrace as actionable evidence for changing its institutions and practices. To support philosophers who pursue this path, we must surface networking activities, change what we see as impact and productivity, and embrace metascience as yet another special science in which philosophers of science can specialize. Thank you.
Who?
Thank you so much, and especially your study was super interesting and very important. But I have a question about your account of socially engaged and empirical research in the social structure of science. So I was a bit unclear about what whether there's some kind of like exclusivity or like some priority thesis you're advocating, in the sense of whether you think that this kind of stuff, this kind of methodology of research is better or should be the only one compared to what, I mean, there's other ways to do social structure of science, like historically, or using formal models or something along those lines. So is there a kind of priority thesis you were advocating, or you're like, maybe we should be whatever goes kind of stuff?
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. Thanks for asking it. One of the remits that we had as speakers was to identify what we see or hope to see in the future of the philosophy of science. And if there is a priority claim, one of the priority claims is the idea that I'd like to see more of this kind of work, and to see ways in which we can create structures that would help facilitate it, for the reasons that I provided. I think that it's epistemically important to get this kind of feedback from the real world. And I think that practically speaking, it's more likely to create impact in the real world. So do I want to, I don't know, dominate, do I want empirical work to dominate other methods for thinking about the social structure of science? I do think conceptual, synthetic, and modeling work can be useful, because I identify as someone who's in the socially engaged philosophy world. For me, choosing methods that increase sort of practical impact are going to be more important for me.
Shall I go first? All right. Okay, so thank you very much, Carole. This was really great. I was wondering, though, if I can push a little bit actually on this issue.
Yeah.
So you were talking about meta-science and the ways in which the Center for Open Sciences pushes some of these ideas. That's a very particular way of thinking about quantitative measures, which I think actually the philosophy of meta-science may well want to address rather critically.
Yeah.
And I was wondering instead, how would you then relate this work to both other types of quantitative work on the social structure of science and also qualitative work? Because one thing that for me was very striking about your talk is that STS was never mentioned.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how you then think about bridging some of this.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and this reflects actually a question that my colleague Connor Mayo-Wilson had asked. So when I talk about meta-science, I want to use it more generically to mean the scientific study of scientific practices, as it was used before it was made quite popular by the Center for Open Science. And so if you think of meta-science or the science of science as involving the use of scientific methods to study scientific practices, then that can include a lot of different methods. They don't have to be just quantitative. They can be qualitative as well. And so I don't see, so for example, in sociology, there are a lot of qualitative techniques used to study how scientific practices work. So by using that term, I don't mean to imply that particular vision of what meta-science is. And I'd rather be more inclusive of the kinds of methods and questions that are of interest. Does that help? Yeah, thank you. I'll have to change that terminology maybe. Maybe that term meta-science has been forever colored now. Yeah, thank you.
So I had the good fortune of sitting next to her, so I get to jump the line. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. So just as a point of centering things, so I'm not a philosopher. I'm a professor in the psychology department, and I primarily study behavior change. And so what I was curious about is sort of this idea of thinking a lot of the ideas you're presenting in the concept of training, right? And thinking that, and it sort of showed up in a talk earlier this morning of sort of when should we be doing this kind of work?
Right.
And I want to sort of, I'd be interested in your thoughts about sort of pushing ahead the idea that we actually should be starting it early.
Yeah.
And in fact, thinking about this at the level of the graduate students, and that maybe one of the things that needs to evolve, particularly to do some of the work at least you're describing, is we need to be co-training graduate students. In other words, that my own graduate students who are in psychology and working on behavior change would benefit from, in a sense, being trained simultaneously with philosophers of science with the interest that you are articulating, right? And so
Yeah.
in some sense, so that this isn't something that is new at the back, you know what I mean? It isn't something that people come to, but rather an approach that people arrive with, almost, if I could say it that way,
Yes.
right? And so I'd be
Yes.
interested if you know of places where that's happening, you have thoughts about that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thanks. So one of the things that has struck me about the structure of academia and how to navigate that is that there are pockets at universities where graduate students can get exposure to mission-oriented interdisciplinary perspectives, and that's through centers that exist on research campuses. So, I'm not sure what the landscape looks like for other kinds of institutions, so this is going to be a kind of parochial response. I apologize for that. But you know, I'm affiliated with a number of centers now, and I'm impressed by the kind of cross-field conversation and interest and research and the training that provides for the graduate students. So it's a wonderful place for training, but it's also a wonderful place for philosophers of science to find collaborators who are interested in interdisciplinary work. Yeah, thanks.
Right. Thank you. So I'm also on the back row here. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I want to push back a little bit on a point that might be a small point, but the point that you made about philosophers not being collaborative.
Yeah.
And this point being based on how many co-authored papers you found in a database. So I think often when philosophers talk about collaborations, they highlight places like these, conferences, conversations, debates, and places that actually within the past couple of, 20, 30 years have fallen out of academic measurement. And so the problem seems not to be that philosophers aren't collaborative, but that we think collaboration is measured by authorship.
Yeah.
And one part of philosophy papers that I always love reading is the acknowledgement section. And I was wondering if that was something that you looked at or thought about sort of including in this type of work.
That's a great question. One of the goals of the project, in fact, that I mentioned was to demonstrate the heterogeneity of authorship practices across fields. So we looked at more than 13 fields and found that co-authorship practices vary quite a bit. And I think that part of it has to do with the cultural expectations about what constitutes an authorship versus an acknowledgement. We used authorship as the metric that we were measuring for, but I fully acknowledge that can overlook the kinds of collaborative contributions that people can make that don't get recognized as an authorship position. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that point.
Good. So, hey, Carole. Yeah. So I had a question about.
Hi.
I had a question about the relation between meta-science and philosophy of science.
Yeah.
On the one hand, I was surprised by the idea that what we should have is philosophy of meta-science, rather than some philosophy of science being part of meta-science. So, I don't necessarily think we need, well, we do, but, I think more interesting is somehow us joining meta-scientists to do work with them. On the one hand, I also feel it has been quite hard to do that over the last 10 years. There's been a lot of demand among meta-scientists for philosophers of science to be involved. Some of us have done it quite successfully, but I think most of us have really ignored meta-science. And meta-scientists have read philosophers, they've gone back, they've read Paul Mills, they've read Popper, they've read, and they've talked a lot about all these philosophers of science. But we haven't really reached out to them in many ways. I think we've been failing in that respect. Mm-hmm. Part of the explanation, but I'd like to hear more thought about that, part of the explanation is because the speed at which we work and the speed at which they work as scientists is really quite different.
Right.
They publish a paper every 4 months. They're constantly on blogs, on Twitter, or X now, or used to be anyway. And we're much slower, and it's really hard to match their pace. So when we make an intervention, they're already moving to the next project. So I personally found it quite difficult to have very productive interaction with some of these folks because they're just much faster than I am because they don't have the same incentives, same requirements, same expectations.
Yeah, that's a great question. No. So the first point, so why think of philosophy of meta-science or science of science? Let's switch that. Philosophy of science as being something that's different from just science of science. It's because of the way that I've defined what science of science is. So if science of science is the scientific study of scientific practices, and if philosophy does not engage in scientific study, then by that definition or characterization, I would say that philosophy of science is out on the outside. That's not to say that philosophy of science can't be quite useful. So a lot of my research pre-tenure was critical engagement with the kinds of techniques and proxies that science of science researchers used in trying to study practices. So this point that was made earlier about, should we really use authorship on a paper to measure collaborative contribution, that's precisely a philosophy of science of science kind of comment, right? The second piece about differences in disciplinary pace and volume, I'll say, is a completely fair point. I think trying to figure out how to, there are a lot of things that get said in the science of science community that could use a lot of philosophical work. So I hear things like, science is cumulative. That's like meant to be stated as an uncontroversial, bald statement. And what does that mean? All sorts of things like that. I suppose that structurally trying to figure out how to engage with meta-sciences can be difficult. This is why I mentioned that whole list of conferences that are created especially to try to foster interdisciplinary conversation. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to join and try to network there. And then the issue of pace, I think, is something that's strange about our discipline. So why are rejection rates at philosophy journals so high when the stakes for being wrong about something are so low? It makes no sense to me, right? So I think that this is something we need to talk about it as a discipline. Is the gatekeeping that we need to be doing at that initial stage? Or is it something that we can use as a post-publication kind of activity through elevating conversations and through citations or conference settings or things like that? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Right here. Sorry. the audio, sorry. Really excellent talk. I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about your role in the project that you featured here, and then maybe more importantly, more broadly, and I think this picks up on some of what you were saying in response to Edward's question just now, but more broadly, what contours you see for the role of philosophers of science in this kind of interdisciplinary work, especially with an eye towards your emphasis on empirical research, right? So where does the philosopher show up on this, and where did you in that work?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, I'd begun the project conceptually in that philosophy of science paper that I mentioned, but, before that point, I had been visiting the Free Statistical Consulting Center at the Center for Statistics and the Social Sciences. That's one of two statistical consulting centers on my campus. One is in biostatistics. And through that, I met with Elena Arusheva, who was very happy to speak with a philosopher. I was surprised. I had all sorts of disciplinary hang-ups about, being the unwelcome person in the room. But it was always a very engaging, educational, respectful conversation. And so she was basically one of the very few social scientists or statisticians that I knew at the time. There was the call for submissions for this NIH prize that a few people sent to me saying, this looks like it's something that would be up your alley. I would never have thought of applying unless people encouraged me to do it, and did so and asked Elena if she would join me in crafting the empirical part analysis of the commensuration bias idea, and we won. So I knew as a philosopher of science, having studied peer review in the federal context, that getting access to data was extremely difficult, and that the NIH in particular had used exemptions to FOIA laws to prevent researchers outside of the institution from getting access to data about the peer review scores, about the process, about funding, rejected applications. But I knew that because we won this prize, we had a unique kind of lever. And we spent 2 years of having conversations with Richard Nakamura, the then director of the Center for Scientific Review, to try to get access. So, if I could, so I suppose that and I had also, cultivated more face-to-face interactions with Dr. Nakamura by going to science conferences where we both happened to be going, and also we got invited to be part of a panel together at AAAS. I guess that is my one of my big roles in the project, and actually that's the step of getting access to data was the least likely step that made the whole project possible. I had already been trying to move towards empirical work because of this kind of conviction that empirical work has more impact. So some of that work on the other study I mentioned on the JSTOR corpus was another project I was taking on at about the same time.
Final, very short question.
So if I think about a discipline that moved from kind of abstract model building, single author culture to a much more empirical, collaborative, data intensive culture is economics. And from my understanding, it happened because there was this embarrassment at failing to successfully predict many economic phenomena. But from what I sense, philosophy of science doesn't have an ambition to be predictively successful. So unless we change that ambition, do you see us becoming more empirical focused if we don't have the ambition to successfully predict?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do philosophers of science have the ambition to be able to predict things in the world? Of course, prediction and explanation are different things. I have to say that in this crowd. I do see papers in the social structure of science that do, remark on things like different facts about the social structure of science as we see it, and they'll cite empirical studies, and then they'll do some modeling work, for example, to try to explain how that could be. And it's people who are careful are always clear that this is a how possibly kind of explanation, and so that isn't necessarily an explanation or explanatory or predictive kind of activity for the real world. But insofar as we think that these problems are important problems because they're problems in the real world, if you want to do socially engaged work, then I think the logical step would be to do empirical work. Yeah, thanks.
Let's thank Carole again. Thanks.